Well, this is our oral history interview with the Midway Historical Committee sponsoring it. My name's Athena Cumarella, and we also have in the audience Lana Nielsen and Kathy Philpott. And we'd love to welcome you here today this is going to be so incredible.
I'm Mary Jane Luke Wood. My parents is Charles Leo Luke. He went by Leo. My mother is Stella Hare. I was born 5th of October, 46. And I lived in Midway till I got married, and then we moved back. I have a rich heritage here. My great-grandfather Luke was the one who owned Luke's Hot Pots. It was a very fun place to be. My dad and all his cousins were the lifeguards there. Their Uncle John got it. He was the oldest son, so he inherited the hot pots from his father. But all the nephews worked there. So it was really a fun place to be when I was growing up. My grandfather Luke was killed in the mine in 1942. And so my grandmother went to work for Uncle John. She worked at the swimming pool and did whatever else they needed. But when I was growing up, she took tickets at the swimming pool. And when you went to Luke's Hot Pot, you went into the fountain, that's what it was called, the soda fountain, and then you bought your tickets there. For kids, it was 10 cents. And I think for adults, it was like 25 cents. Anyway, so then they would take the tickets to my grandma and give them to her as they went into the swimming pool. So when she worked there, me and my sister got to go up there a lot and swim. But my grandma never took anything from anybody, so she always paid for our tickets. So anyway, and she would watch us swim. So it's really fun. She did the laundry there. She took care of all the swimming suits, the towels, washed them, hung them up to dry. And the swimming suits at that time were wool. And so the moths would get in, and they would eat holes in the swimming suits. And so Grandma did all the darning on the swimming suits to keep them so that they could be rented out. So I don't know if many people knew that or not, but that's what she did. And so she worked for my Uncle John, and then when the Irwins took over, she worked for them also. So anyway, so I had a lot of time that I got to go up to Luke's Hot Pots and swim. So it was a fun place to be. And my mother worked there as a young girl. She waited on all the banquets they had there. The banquets were magnificent. They were known nationwide for their fried chicken and their steak dinners. And so it was, and Aunt Alida's brother, Johnny Ross, was the cook. And so he was became famous for the meals they had at Luke's Hot Pots. I went there to a lot of family reunions, mostly not the Luke reunions, mostly my other family reunions. But they had family reunions there. I like to look at all the old newspapers. It would tell about primary classes coming from Heber and all over. People from Roosevelt, Duchesne came to have picnics here, and for the youth of that. Park City High School, they came here for their senior day and would have it up here at Luke's Hot Pots. So there was a lot of things that went on up there that was really fun. So, and they had cabins. They had 6, I can't remember if it was 4 or 6 cabins that were there until the Paynes took over. And so then little by little, they, of course, weren't taken very good care of, and neither was the other part. So it literally started to fall apart. And Dr. Draper was our family doctor. Him and Jean Payne were partners. And so and then Dr. Draper passed away, questionably. And so anyway, so then the Paynes were the full owners then. I guess his wife sold her share out to him, I don't know. But so then they took over running it at that time. And several other people, it had been known as the Diamond D, and then it was known as, what was the other one? I can't remember now, but I remember the Diamond D. And through the other ones, even though they were it was, they leased it out to buy, then it all turned back to Uncle John. About 4 times it turned back to him. And so anyway, so it went through different hands during the time, and I don't know why the Irwins quit. He was and Jerry Springer will tell you all about that was his Aunt Polly, or Pauline, and Springer, Irwin. And he had something to do with the movie stars. And so that's when the movie stars started to come to Midway, he was a representative to a lot of them. And Roy Rogers came when I was a young girl. He was in the town hall over here. And my Uncle Tom was young. I had young uncles. He was like 18 or 19, and we went up and he held me on his shoulder so that I could see Roy Rogers. So that's some of my memories. We used to have the wrestles, the professional wrestlers. I don't know if anybody knows that or not. Man Mountain Dean was a famous wrestler. That he came with all his group. His daughter was a wrestler, and they would have the wrestling matches here in the Midway Town Hall. So my uncle Delbert, he was handicapped. When he was born, his spine was injured at birth, and so it left his motor nerves damaged, so he couldn't talk plain, and he had a hard time walking. But he loved the wrestlers, and I always say it wrong. So anyway, so we'd always bring him up when they'd come so he could watch them. So anyway, it was interesting what all came there. So, but that was one of the points I remember about, and then at Luke's Hot Pots, my grandma used to have an album plumb full of all the movie stars that came. It very conveniently come up missing. So I don't know who got it, but anyhow, she had all the autographs of all the Hollywood stars that came. And it was an interesting time of growing up there.
What years would have that been?
Probably the 48 to early 50s. And I remember that Roy Rogers used to come up here and spend summers, and we had a guy that lived on our street was a highway patrolman, Mike Gale, and he would take Roy Rogers and they would go hunting and fishing. So that's a little bit of history of Midway, how the movie stars came to come here. So, but yeah, I better get back to my family. I have an older sister, Joan, and I had a younger sister, Kathleen, who we lost 4.5 years ago. Sorry about that. Anyway, so that was our family, and then I was privileged to live with my grandma on the side of me, and my grandma here across the street. I had 13 uncles. My mother had 7 brothers, and my dad come from 7 boys. So I had 13 uncles, and our younger uncles kind of they were closer to my oldest sister's age, and my Aunt Gay, she was 3 years older than my sister. So they were more like our brothers and sisters than they were my uncles and aunt. And when my grandpa died, my grandma kind of had a rough time. She was left with 7 children at home. When my grandpa died of a heart attack at 52, his name was Samuel Monroe Hare. And my grandmother's name was Margaret Adele Murray. And she always went by Adele. So anyway, they had 11 children. My mother was the 5th of that family. And we were close. And I remember my Uncle Jack would take me and my sister Joan out and fly kites with us, and he tried really hard to teach me how to ride a bike, but I never could get on it till one day I decided I was going to take off on it myself, and I went up Center Street barefooted and come down the hill from where the stake center is now down to the corner and tried to turn to go towards home, and I couldn't get the brakes to work, so I dragged my feet and drug all my toenails off. So yeah, that was not a good thing. Learn how to stop a bike before you get on it. But that was just some of the things that, when I was growing up. And Midway at that time had maybe 800 people. So we knew everybody. And we were related a lot through a lot of people. My ancestry, my Salzer line is Swiss. My Murray Hassler line is Swiss, and my mother's dad's side were all Scotch and Irish. So I had all that. And then my Lukes, they were originally from Scotland, but then they came here from Manchester, England. So that was my heritage. So
Did they come directly?
they come directly here. The lady that owned, her name was Aunt Agnes O'Neill. She was famous for the, well, it wasn't a bed and breakfast then, it was a little hotel or whatever. That was my great-great aunt. My great-great-grandfather, Samuel Hare Sr., was her brother. And so they had come to Midway directly. And so then she wrote to him and they wanted them to come here. They were in Pennsylvania first. And my great-great-grandmother wanted to get her sons out of the coal mines. And so they came here, when they joined the church, they came here to Utah, Pennsylvania first, and the first thing they did is went back into the mines to get enough money to cross and to come to Utah. And so then when they got here, of course they lived with them until they could find a home. So that's how the Hares came to be. And my great-grandfather, Samuel Hare Jr., was one of the first mayors of Midway. And he was the first mayor in the history of Midway to get Midway out of debt. And my mother always told us that story, and I thought, oh, well, maybe she just... But I found a newspaper article in one of the old newspapers in Salt Lake, one of the old Telegram, I think it was, and there it said Samuel Hare and gave all the information about him getting Midway out of debt. So he was instrumental in a lot of things here at the beginning. So he was.
Jane, you said your mother, your grandfather died or young, so your grandmother was raised. How did your family support itself at that point?
At that time, there wasn't a lot they could do. Grandpa was one of the road superintendents, and he had the strawberry run under H.T. Coleman. H.T. Coleman was for the county, and Grandpa was under him, and he would go out to Strawberry in the winter and spend 2 or 3 weeks there when the snow was really bad, and then he would come home. So they only got to see him, a little bit. My mother said it was so exciting when he got home. And she said how when he was out taking care of the roads, the sheep herders would come through and they'd have bum lambs, which they called them bum lambs after their mother had passed away or whatever, the ewe. And they would give them to my grandfather. And so he would bring them home, and my mother and her sister and little brothers would raise the little lambs on bottles. And so that's one way that they had the meat, And then my grandfather, they were also miner. He worked in the mine for a time. My grandfather great-grandfather Hare was a very large, well-known miner for this area. He discovered the richest silver vein in the Silver King Coalition mine in Park City. And he was a paid prospector for a long time because he loved the work. It never got out of his blood, even when they left Scotland and came here. He still went into mining, but it was prospecting and not coal mines once they got here. But he had a lot of claims, and that John the Revelator was one of them. There's controversy over that between somebody else that has wrote the history. But my grandfather said he had a revelation from John the Revelator. And so he was told that if he would use the minerals and the ores that came out of this mine, and that he would be blessed, and as long as he used it for good stuff, the mine would still produce. And they had a habit of changing mines. Don't ask me why, but H.T. Coleman and Grandpa were partners. So anyway, there was a lot of, this mine would be worked by this person at this time, and then this other mine would be worked at from another person. So anyway, that's what they did. But during the Depression, my grandfather's still alive. He died in 42. And his father, they had a little farm, and they would grow all the vegetables that they could grow in the farm. And then they would take, and all those who were in need, they would secretly put the stuff on the doorstep so they didn't know who it was coming from. And so that's how he used the money that he made. A guy from Park City came, he wanted to interview me, he wanted to see the house that my great-grandfather lived in, and I showed him, and he says, a man as rich as he was and with all the money he had lives in this small of house? And I says, well, that's where he lived. And so anyway, they had a sad life. His wife's name was Mary Jane Shelton. I'm named after her, my mother's grandmother. She watched all her children die. And so and my great-grandfather outlived her. My mother's Aunt Jeanette died when she was almost 17 years old on Halloween from heart problems. I was the only daughter in the family, and then my grandfather was the oldest son. His younger brother died from pneumonia. His friends had been out partying. They took him home and left him on the lawn. This was in May. It had snowed. They left him there all night. They went out and found him on the lawn, took him in the house, and 2 weeks later he died. So that was her youngest son. And his marriage hadn't worked out, and so it was a really sad situation. And then my grandfather, of course, died in 42. And so she had lost her children. And you wanted to know about spiritual experiences. She mourned the death of her daughter so bad, it just broke her heart. And my mother told me that she had told her that she had a dream, and Aunt Jeanette, her name was Mary Jeanette, and she came to her and she said, Mother, if you don't stop mourning me, I can't be about my work. And she said that when she looked, that she showed her in a classroom situation where she was teaching young people. And so she said, all of a sudden then she realized that her daughter was in a better place and she had to quit mourning her death. So it was really a spiritual thing for her. And she was 4'8", and her maiden name was Mary Jane Shelton. And her mother was Mary Jane Morton, and she was from Scotland. And John Morton was their father, and he was into mining in this area too. So John Shelton took his family to Wanship when my great-grandmother was 10 years old. They went up to Wanship because he had a thing on logging, and so him and some of the other guys from this area went up to cut the lumber for the mines. And while he was up there, her mother took ill, and she asked her to take her little brother and sister. She had 2 little brothers and 1 little sister, and she asked if she would take them over in the other side of the cabin and stay with them because she did not want them to watch her die. And so at 10 years old, my great-grandmother lost her mother. And so then my great-grandfather blamed himself, and he came back to Midway, and the kids were farmed out. And her grandmother, Martin, took my grandmother, and then she had to go out and work for a living. She would go and take care of women that were having babies, or she would take in laundry and do whatever she could, or go out to help as a sort of a maid at 10 years old, so she could help her grandma with the money to take care of them. And her brother and sister went to live with Aunt Polly Fawcett, who was well known in Midway as she knew all the herbs and things and would help people out. And she took my grandmother's brother Johnny and her sister Margaret, which we called Aunt Maggie, and raised them. Her children were almost all raised, so she took them in. And they lived up in, I can't remember, I get my flats mixed up. I can't remember if it was Buttermilk Flat or Bonanza Flats, I think it was. And they would stay there for the summer, and they would take their produce. They take all their animals with them. So did my great-grandpa Sam Hare and my grandma Mary Jane Hare. they would go up for the summer and they would sell their cheese and their eggs and their milk and whatever to the miners over in Park City. And so they would stay there all through there while Grandpa was mining. And then Grandma would come back down during the fall so that the kids could be in school, which was she only had the 3 little kids. But so that's what they did. And so it was, that's how they made their living a lot. And I remember a little thing, my mother wrote her histories. I wish I'd have brought them with me. She told about her grandma and Emily Coleman riding the buggies up to the mining so they could be with their husbands for a little while and then take the kids and then come back home. And then my little grandma, like I said, she was 4'8". She decided she couldn't go up there anymore when the kids got a little older, and so she took over taking care of the farm. And the farm, what used to be our farm too, is now where the Mexican restaurant is on Main Street. Across from the river road, that was our mine. And so I'm going hither around, I hope that's all right. But another story that I'll tell you about that was not right in the book that they wrote about the homes in Midway, and that it was Lige Watkins. I knew him personally. My dad drove a Willys Jeep truck, and so when Lige needed something, his home was the red home right next to that, and he would come out on the porch and he'd holler, "Leo, I need some help. Would you mind coming over?" And so we'd go over and I'd go with him. And he said to me, "Come here, I want to show you something." And so I said, "Okay." So I went with him and he took my hand and he had these great big huge books, really big books, sitting on a table. He said, "Now give me your hand." And so I did, and he'd take my hand across. He says, "That's an A, this is a B," and then he would tell me the words as I took my hand across those. He said, "That's how I read." And that was Braille, the first Braille books. And so they said that he was only partial blind, he was totally blind. And the reason I know is because my mother's great uncle, Joe Hare, and Lige were working in the same mine when the explosion happened. And my Joe Hare picked in and hit a dynamite stick that had been missed, and the explosion came and it hit him and killed him, and then it blinded Lige. And he said to me, the last thing I ever remember on this earth was seeing Joe Hare's head fly through the air. And Lige was 21 years old at the time.
What mine was that?
Do you know, I can't remember the name of it.
But was it in Park City?
No, it was up here in the mountains.
The Snake Creek mine?
Yeah, and I can't remember. There were so many different mines at that time. I'm sure I've got it because I've got Lige's history at home that he wrote. I just can't remember right now what the name of the mine was. But anyhow, so that's what happened to him. And my dad, when he was a young boy, Lige would have the young men help him because he didn't want to give up his farming. And so he would walk beside them with the team of horses, and the young boys would help him out when he did his farm work. So that's the story of Lige Watkins. I knew him. My great-great-grandfather, Samuel Harris Sr., when they came, they had 13 children. One of them died in Scotland, and then they renamed the second one Thomas after the one that died in Scotland. And then they had her youngest 2 children were born here when they got here, my Aunt Nettie and their son William. And William's buried up the cemetery when he was a little boy with his mother and dad. So anyway, but they talk about the great-grandfather Hare, and he wasn't a happy person. He was mean. I ran onto a history that one of his older granddaughters had brought. We wondered why all this stuff had happened. My grandfather, great-grandfather Samuel Jr., bought a little house across from where the old, where Ike Stewart's home is now. Was a little cabin there. And so my grandfather bought that house from my Murray line, his Hassler line. A little lady lived there. She's on my family side too, and she was handicapped. She had club feet, and so she couldn't hardly walk around. And so anyway, my mom would go over and weed her flower gardens. She was on my grandma's hair side, the Hassler line. But anyway, the great-grandpa was mean, and we didn't know. I mean, we wondered why that the little old grandma lived all by herself in this little house, and then my grandfather lived up on Center Street in a pot rock home, which is right next to the stake center that they've remodeled. And he was vindictive. And I remember these stories. Guy Coleman told me, he said, we went up one day, and he said, me and Dick Hamilton, we were young kids, and we went up with knicker knocking. And they would rap at the doors and the windows, and then they would run. And so he said they went up there and went up to Sam Hare Senior's, and he said he came out of the house and he said, damn ye to hell, Hamilton, I'll kill you doon. So anyway, because he had caught Dick Hamilton as he was running away, but he didn't catch Guy. So he was awful. And one of my grandfather's cousins wrote, and she did a little personality thing about each member of the family, and she put how he was ornery and a vindictive person. And to me, the picture of him always looked like he had such sad eyes. I don't think he wanted to leave and come to America. I mean, that's my opinion, because he wasn't happy. He didn't look happy. But anyway, I ran onto a history on Family Search. Someone had put this history in about, she knew him personally. She was an older of the grandchildren. And she wrote down that he would get, I shouldn't even tell this, should I? But he was a drinker, and he got drunk, and then he would take it out on my grandmother and the kids. And so when she knew he was drinking, she would pick up the children, and she would leave and go over to the neighbors and hide in their cellar until he was sober enough, and then she would return home. Well, I guess my great-grandpa got upset over this and seen that this is what was going on with his mother. And so he moved her into the little house by herself and basically took care of his mom until she decided to go to Park City and live with her, be shared, taken care of by her two daughters over in Park. So it was kind of a sad situation there. But my grandpa always seen that his family was taken care of, my great-grandfather. And he was a good man, and everybody knew him and loved him. So, and he was a good-looking man. He was a handsome man. In fact, I have their pictures on my wall in the front room. My little granddaughter came in and she said, "Who's that good-looking man, Grandma?" And I said, "That's your great-great-grandpa." Great-great-great-grandpa. Anyway, it was kind of cute, but and it was a sad life. Like I said, they had a lot of heartache, but they kept going, and they both sang. And so my mother, she always told us how her dad and her grandma and grandpa would sing together. And she said her dad and her grandpa were Irish tenors. And she said they sang a lot. And she said, "I wished we'd had recordings then so you could have heard them." And then when my mother and her family were growing up, like I said, there was 11 children. And in the summer, they would go out on their back porch and they would all play. My grandfather taught my mother and her brothers, her older brothers, and my Aunt Jeanette how to play musical instruments. So they all played the violins. My mother played a guitar until the day she passed away. She played a guitar. She played a mandolin. And then they had a little harpsichord that he played. My grandpa Hare played the musical saw. He taught Levon Hare, his cousin, how to play the musical saw, and Levon would go all over Midway and play the musical saw because my grandfather had taught him how to play it. My grandpa Samuel Monroe Hare, sang at the first silent movies in Heber. So they were a very gifted, talented family. And the neighbors would come by on walks in the summer and stand by the fence and listen to them sing. So it was, and my mother for years, for 27 years, she was the music leader for the primary. And she loved kids and she loved music. And every time you'll see a kid that remembers my mother, she taught us how to sing. We'll always remember Stella. She taught us how to sing, and she entertained her and my sister Joan would entertain at the care centers in Heber. They were called to sing at funerals. I have these stories I won't tell. I guess I shouldn't. But anyway, my mom and Aunt Jeanette were supposed to sing in church, so they did, and they sang one song. And then she said they wanted them to do an encore. And so the only song they could remember was something about a man that went a-fishing. And it wasn't a very appropriate song to sing in church. And so when they quit singing and they got off, my grandfather said, "Next time I'm going to teach you 2 different songs to sing." So anyway, but they laughed about that, so that's in her history too. And then you ask how they took care of families. Again, my grandma here did not write anything. I did not know a lot about her. Of course, she had kids that were almost the same age as me and my sister. And so we weren't really, she had all this. But my mother said when my grandpa died that her mother just kind of basically went into her own little world for a long, long time. And my mom and dad became parents for her younger siblings. And so they did everything with the kids. The kids went down and helped them on the farm. They helped build the house when Mom and Dad built their house. But Grandma was she just didn't talk a lot about things. And so when I got Mama's history and Aunt Jeanette's history, I found out a lot about my grandmother. And my 2 grandmothers both had sons in World War II. And so they would go down to the Veterans Hospital in Salt Lake. They would belong to the VFW and would listen to the soldiers, or they would write letters for them, or just visit with them. And so they went down, I think it was once or twice a month, they would all go as a group and would go down to the Veterans Hospital in Salt Lake. That's the first I knew of her. One day we was in church, though, I went to Mutual. It was called Mutual then. And they also had it for the elderly people, the older people. And we'd meet in the chapel, and the older people would stay in the chapel, and they would have their lesson in the chapel. And my grandmother Hare would take her crocheting with her and work on her crocheting while she was there. And then my grandma Luke, she would go too, so I would walk over to the church with them. And one day, Grandma was talking to Marthy Berge, and it was this language I'd never heard. I said, "Grandma, I didn't know you could speak a different language," but she spoke German because her parents were right from Switzerland. But the story of that is that my grandparents would not speak English around my grandfather. And so he knew they were talking about him when they said Monroe, because he went by Monroe. And so anyway, they did a lot of that. And so then my grandmother and grandfather decided that they would not teach their children another language, that they would speak English only. So my mother said the only words they ever picked up were swear words, so she didn't use them very often. So anyway, but that was my Hare family. And like I said, my great-grandpa Hare was the only grandfather I had, because both my grandfathers died before I was born. And my mother and dad were building the house, and so they would take me, I guess I was about a year and a half old, and my mother would tie me to the fence. And my grandpa, of course at that time, he was living with his daughter-in-law, my grandma, because his family, was gone, and so he was getting older, and so he moved in where my grandmother could take care of him. And he would see me out tied to the fence. And my mother would say, all you'd have to do is just make a little cry. And he was over there giving her a Scottish blessing. And so he'd untie me and take me to the store, and I'd get ice cream. So, and he kind of was partial to me because I was named after his wife. So anyway, so he did that. So the only grandpa, like I said, I ever knew was my great-grandfather. And he was going blind and he was going deaf by the time, that he passed away. But he was our grandpa. and he was a kind, and he carried candy in his pocket for us. And it was the old-fashioned mints, and he'd have those in his pocket. So he could always hand us out a mint. And if he didn't have mints, he had those nasty Vicks cough drops in his pocket. And so if he'd run out of mints, he'd hand you a Vicks cough drop. And oh, I hated those things, but I didn't want to hurt his feelings, so I'd keep it in my mouth till he left, and then I'd spit it out. But he was kind, and that's the grandpa I remember. And like I said, I didn't get to know the others. But when I read my grandmother's history and found out how much food she had to can a year to take care of her family, it was amazing. I don't know how she ever did it. But like I said, that's in my history of her, and it's really neat to find out all about her. And she was, I don't think she come from a family that showed much love, and I don't think she knew how to show much love. My mother said she doesn't remember her ever hugging her or anything until she got older and had her at the store, and one lady walked up and to her and she said to the lady, she said, "I don't know what I'd do without this girl." And she reached over and patted her, because my mother was the only family member that lived in Midway. Everybody else went somewhere else to live, and so my mom and dad took care of both their mothers. So while they were alive, seeing to their needs. But anyway, that was the Hare family. Then my grandma Luke, who lived next door to us, her name was Cordelia Shelton Luke. And my grandfather was Charles Franklin Luke, and he went by Frank. And they had the 7 sons. And my oldest uncle, Delbert, was handicapped, and because he had the injury of the spine. But my grandmother was in labor for 3 days, and they finally called the doctors in, and the doctor, one of them came from Park City and the other one came from Heber to try and save her. They told my grandfather, it's either hurt the baby or lose both of them. You have your choice. We need to save your wife or the baby. And so they, of course, chose my grandmother to save. But when Delbert was born, he had a spine injury, like I said, that hurt his motor nerves. And Aunt Dealey Wilson was the midwife. And so they, after the baby was born, they just put him on a pile of dirty linen to die. He just laid him there. They didn't pay any attention to him. And so she went over and she checked, and she could tell that he was still breathing. And so she hurried and she put him in warm water and then cold water, then warm water, then cold water, and he started to cry. And so if it hadn't been for her, he would not have been here. She literally saved his life. So she had delivered my grandmother, and then she delivered her son. And my grandmother was named Cordelia after her. But my grandmother always went by Delia or Aunt Deal. So, and my grandpa called her Corey. So anyway, but she was a very strong woman. Her son, she lost her youngest son when he was 12 years old. They said it was, I can't remember what they called it at the time, but we were told it was a brain tumor. And they had to take him down to Salt Lake to the hospital, so my mother and dad drove their car down and followed, and my sister was just a baby then. And so they took her with her, and Grandpa told her to take the baby to a motel and everything. And then my dad said he woke up in the night with this horrible, horrible noise, and he said to my mother, "Did you hear that horrible noise?" And Mama said no, and he says, "Well, Lynn's dead, I know it." And so the next morning they went to the hospital and the cars were gone. So then they knew he had passed away. And so then that was in November, what year was it? I can't remember the month. Anyway, 10 months later, my grandfather was killed in the mine. And so she lost her son and her husband within a year of each other. And so she had a lot of faith, a strong testimony. She served in different, the Relief Society, the primary, the young men. She was a scout leader for the boys. She did all kinds of stuff like that in her to serve the church. But then she also had to go to work, and so then she worked at, like I said, up to Luke's Hot Pots so that she could earn money for him. And she was a very, very spiritual person. I learned a lot through her, compassion for others. She was always serving others. She went to school in Midway. They graduated in 8th grade then. When they were 16, they were graduating from 8th grade. And her and my grandmother and Lethe Coleman and Merle Madsen, that was Lethe's sister, were all the same age and went to school together, so they were all good friends. And I knew them well. Grandma Hare was a seamstress. She was a very beautiful sewer, and she made all my mother's dresses. She made her graduation dress that I have. And when my grandma Luke got married she made my grandma's wedding dress. And so then she made I had twin uncles, and she made them little coveralls and stuff. So my grandmother was telling me how my grandma Hare had made clothes, because grandma didn't sew. And anyhow, so she told me once, and maybe this is too personal, I don't know what people like, but when my Uncle Lynn died, well, I was just a little girl, and we lived with my grandma till I was 2 years old, and our house got finished. But grandma said she had me on her lap, and she picked up the photo album, and she said, she was showing me the pictures, and I said, "Oh, that's little Lenny. He told me I was coming to live with his brother." And she said, "I didn't know what to drop first, you or the book." So anyway, that's been a special thing for me and my family, because I don't know whether it was for me or for her that would have happened. So I was very, very close to her. And she was an example. She was the widow's mite. Because when the missionaries would go from Midway, didn't matter if they were Midway 2nd, Midway 1st Ward, she sent them each $1 every month. And it wasn't a lot of money, because she didn't have a lot of money. But it was enough for them, probably a whole meal at that time. I've got a thank you note from Barbara Kohler Christensen to my grandmother for that. And that's what she did. And when people were in need, she went and helped out a lot. So she had a very strong testimony of the gospel. The bishop told her she didn't need to pay tithings, and she said, "Yes, I do. I'm not going to lose those blessings." And so she did. And another thing they told her not to baptize my uncle because he was handicapped and he didn't need it. And she said, "Yes, he does. He's 8 years old and he will be baptized." And so she went against what the bishop had told her, and he was baptized. But anyhow, it was, like I said, and Uncle Delbert he had a hard life. He kept telling me, I wish I could pass away so I could run and walk like the other kids do. He felt bad because he could never have a family like his brothers had, which was, but after he got older, then I said to him, he was yell at me and my cousin, because we'd go in and stay at Grandma's, and she told us we could do anything we wanted. And he'd say, "I can't hear the TV." Anyway, he'd get upset with us. But anyhow, later he says, the reason was, he said, "I kind of was jealous of your dads, having kids, and I could never have that." But he said, "But I had you kids around me." And he says, "Now I'm older, and I had my children." And we had our children coming along. And they would go into his room, because when my grandma died, they built a room on our house, and he was taken in there. So he lived with my mom and dad the last part of his life. And he loved the kids. My oldest son, Leo, has very much compassion and is very quiet. And he'd like to sit with Uncle Delbert and listen. And he said, "I wish now I would have listened to more of the stories." And it was hard because the other kids were really on the go, and they didn't have patience to sit and listen. But anyway, he would sit, and he said, "Oh, your kids mean so much to me." So it was good, and they got to enjoy him for a little while. But they fixed him a little golf cart, and he could ride it around town. My uncle got it, and Wayne Bonner fixed it up for him to ride. And he stayed at the side of the roads, And he liked to go up to the cemetery when my dad had a grave to dig or was up there working. So he would get on the little cart and he would ride up the roads. We didn't have a lot of traffic then. And he always stayed off to the side of the road. And so he'd ride up to the cemetery and then he'd ride back down. And everybody knew him, so if he had any problems, they'd call Mom on the phone and say, Delbert's stranded, or, you know, can you get hold of Leo to come get him? And so Mom would call Dad on the CB radio and say, Delbert's this place, and so he'd go get him. Well, then people started to move in more and more. And so one of them didn't like him being on the road, even though he had stayed off the side of the road. They turned him into the highway patrol. And so they told him he could no longer ride his cart. And that just kind of did him in, because that was the only way he had of getting out and visiting. He'd go up and visit his cousin George, who worked on cars up Center Street, and he would go watch him. And it was just kind of sad that they came in and made a big issue of it, and he could no longer ride the cart. But things change. So anyway, and then in 1952, my Uncle Fay was killed in the mine. And my grandma couldn't take anymore. She told her sons, you've got to get out of the mine. I can't take it. I can't lose another family member. And a year after my Uncle Fay got killed in the mine, my Uncle Dean went hunting and slid down a mountain, and the trigger caught on a sagebrush and went off and went through his stomach and out his back. And so when they come with the news of that, she just, you know, I mean, she said, no, I can't. But she had strength. But anyway, Uncle Dean survived and ran the dairy or temp freeze for years. But it was just, she went through a lot. She really did. But she always had faith. My mother was like almost 2 years old, and my Aunt Jeanette was older than her. She was supposed to be watching her, and my grandpa was upstairs remodeling or doing something on the house. Anyhow, he hollered out the upstairs window and asked her, he said, Jeanette, where's the baby? And she says, I don't know. And so then they heard the cow mooing. And so she went, looked, and she said, she's in the trough. And so my grandmother said that her grandpa went down the stairs and never hit a stair and ran out, and my mother had drowned. So they got her out of there, and the bishop lived across the road, and John Van Wagner was the bishop then, and that's where my grandma and Grandpa Luke lived. But at that time, John Van Wagner lived there. And so he said to Jeanette, run across the road and get the bishop. And so they went and got the bishop. And then they rolled Mama over a barrel and kept rolling her over the barrel until the water came out and she started to breathe. And the bishop gave her a blessing. And then later, when she got a little bit older, he said, you know, Stella, you were saved for something special because you were dead. And so anyway, that's, you know, they did go through a lot. But, and like I said, my dad lived on one side, Mom lived on the other. Instead of the girl next door, he married the girl across the street. So, and he told her when she was 14 he was going to marry her, and she said, you are not. She ran around with his younger brother that was closer to her age, and he was 4 years older, and she said, you're not marrying me. And he says, I am. And he told that to my grandma. Mom, this is the girl I'm marrying. Well, he eventually did, but anyway. And so through them came 3 daughters. So anyway, and then after my Uncle Fay was killed in 52 in the mine, my grandmother just begged them to get out, because my Uncle Fay had a twin brother, Ray. Ray and Fay were twins. But anyway, Glade Bonner was over the Midway then. I guess he was the marshal. I don't know if that's what they called him, but he was over, I think he was the marshal. And he seen Dad, and he said to him, Leo, he says, Midway's looking for somebody to take over. I'm going to retire. He said, why don't you go up and talk to the mayor? And so he did. He went out and he says, you go up the cemetery and dig the grave that I need dug. And if you dig that grave, you're hired. And so he went up and dug the grave in the Midway Cemetery. The first grave he dug in the Midway Cemetery was my husband's uncle, Johnny Lundeen. So anyway, it was just, but he was hired right on then, and he was the town marshal. And then when it became a city, he became the chief of police. And people have come in to talk to my daughter where she works, and they said, oh, they asked her how she's related, and she's Leo Luke was my grandpa. And they said, Leo Luke was Midway. She said, Mom, I want you to write a book, and I want you to entitle it Leo Luke was Midway. I wrote a short one, and I wrote The Life of a Midway Town Marshal, and all he had to go through, but it's only like maybe 8 pages. But she wants me to do a book because she said everybody knew him. So anyway, long story short, that's how he became the Midway Marshal, and loved his job, loved the people. His job included animal control, road superintendent, water superintendent, Midway Town Hall and grounds superintendent, maintenance, what else? Cemetery sexton, and he even at one time was the building inspector. I found that in a newspaper article, and just on and on and on. He was here from daylight to dark when Swiss days happened. He did. I mean, I've got newspaper articles. Like I said, thank heaven for old newspapers. The Provo Herald had all these things about Swiss days when it began, and so I mean, it just all the things he did. And they had in the hotel, town hall, they had all kinds of banquets. And my Uncle Dean was a cook, and so was my dad a cook. And so when they would have the banquets for the ward banquets or the town, they used to have town banquets every year. So they were the cooks. And so Uncle Dean would come over and put the meat in the ovens, and then my dad would take care of it through the day, and then he would make the gravy and mash the potatoes and whatever. Anyway, and then the women would come and they would serve the meals, and it was really a fun time to grow up. A lot of things was free. But anyhow, that's my family. My sister Joan, like I said, she sang with Mama all the time, and they entertained everywhere and to all occasions. My sister Kathleen, she played the guitar, flamingo guitar and whatever. So went to college, went on a mission to France and Belgium, and then came home. I got married right out of high school, graduated in '64, got married in '65. My husband, I had seen him, knew kind of who he was, but hadn't really met him. And my friend decided he was going with one of my other friends, and my other friend decided that she didn't want him going with her, so she set up a blind date with me. And that's how I started to go with it. He was from here, his family was from here. His father wasn't. His father was from Rhode Island. My husband's Alonzo Wade Wood. He goes by Wade, always has. But yeah, his mother was a Lundeen. So he has come from this area. He was gone for quite a while. I mean, as a kid, he was left here with his Lundeen family and raised by them for a while, by a couple of his aunts. And then he was served in the service. He was over in Korea. And then he come home and worked in the Forest Service. And then he went down to work at the Tooele Ordnance Depot, and that's where we lived for 26 years. Was in Grantsville while he worked at the Tooele Ordnance Depot. And then we came back home. So we've been married, we'll be married 59 years on June 18th of this year. Okay, the elementary school, we had we didn't go to kindergarten full year. We went, when I was going to school, you got to go for a week in the last of the summer to get you acquainted with your classmates that you were going to have and to learn how to mingle with each other. And so we'd go, and our school teacher's name was Miss Hilliard. And we had our little rugs, and we'd have our little nap rugs that you would lay down for so many minutes. And then we'd have, in that time, we had canned orange juice. You didn't have frozen orange juice. You had canned orange juice. And I really liked it. But anyway, I don't think they can it anymore. But anyway, we'd have that. And then we had graham crackers with it. And that was our snack. And so we learned kind of how to write the alphabet and our names and whatever, and then how to play. They had a little store that you played and got to know each other in their little store. And then we went right into first grade from that. And Miss Hilliard was our first grade teacher too. In the second grade, we had Miss Bessendorfer. And then they were right at the front of the school as you went in the front doors. The second grade was on the north side, and the first grade was on the south side. And then we went to Maud Derry was our third grade teacher. And then we went to the fourth grade. In the fourth grade, when we got in there wasn't enough kids in third grade and fourth grade, so they combined us. And so we, when one group of us, when either the fourth grade would read while the other ones did math, and then the other ones would read while we did math, and that's what they did. Well, Merle Dean was our teacher. And I sat right at the front of the room. And so she got sick at a lunch hour. And Dorothy Kohler worked there, and I can't remember who else worked in the lunch room at that time. And they called me and said, Mary Jane, will you bring Mrs. Dean's boots and her coat and her purse to us? And so I did, and she'd got sick in the classroom, so I got her stuff and I carried it out, and she was sitting on the step with her head laid in her hands. And they took her home, and 20 minutes later she died. She had a heart attack. So yeah, it was quite a sad situation that year. And then we had 2 or 3 different teachers. We had Mrs. Lemon came down from Camas and taught us for a little while, and then they got somebody else, and then another teacher, and then they had a BYU student come up and help out, and then finally Rachel Smith. She lived in Hebron, and she was a school teacher, and they called her over, and she finally became the 4th grade school teacher over here for a few years. Then that wasn't bad enough. We went through that. Then we got up into 6th grade, and in those days, the 6th grade teacher was also the principal. And so Clarence Probst was our principal and our 6th grade teacher. Well, in 6th grade, he had a heart attack, and so he had to retire. And so then we had Eva Wilson, and I just loved Mrs. Wilson. Brad Wilson's grandma. And I just thought the world of her, and I learned penmanship from that lady, and she had us do all the little fun things. I loved it. I was a horrible writer till I got her as a teacher. And so, but boys in our class, and I won't mention names, she couldn't handle. And so Mark Rasband, who had been our 5th grade teacher, traded, and we got Mark again for 6th grade, and she went on to 5th grade. So, and then of course he had to retire, like I said. But when we went to grade school, Mr. Probst was very strict about music. And he led the Swiss choir for years. He did Swiss Dates, the program. But anyhow, he was a character, and he would tell us all these things that he would experienced on his mission, and about baptizing people in the river and all this stuff. And my husband used to say, if you'd get him talking, then you didn't get homework. So Wade went to grade school here too. But he was an interesting teacher, and they were all nice. But anyway, and then grade school, we had to come down to the town hall for our gym classes. And so we would walk down and go here for gym, and then I think they divided us up so that the older classes went at one time and the younger classes went at another time. And then at the end of the year we had a dance festival. And so we'd all learn the whole school would learn how to do dances, and we did square dancing. One group would do that, and then another one would do something else. And so the classes, the different grades, would do different types of dances. So I got pictures of that, of what we did. So anyway, it was a fun time to live here, and I had a special childhood because my dad worked here, and so he'd pick me up for lunch and take me home every day for lunch, and then I'd go back. I never ate hot lunch because we just lived a block over, but Anyway, and I got to do a lot of things in the Midway Town Hall. And a lot of people don't know what it was used for a lot, and it was used for a lot of things. But I guess I better finish telling about my children. I get my oldest son, it was named after my father. His name's Leo Wadewood. And then I had a Chad Allenwood. They're 14 months apart. And then I had my daughter Alicia. And then I lost twin girls in between her and Clint. I had Clint, and then I had Ann, and then I had Daniel. So I've got 4 sons and 2 daughters, and my daughters are 9 years apart. So anyway, it's but they've all been good kids. They've all turned out really good. And I forgot Daniel. Don't let me forget Daniel. Daniel's the youngest one. He always tells me, yeah, you made everybody a quilt but me. You'll write your history and you'll leave me off. But I didn't. And they've been so good. I don't know what I would do without them, especially at this time, because Daniel's chauffeured us down to the hospital every day for Wade's chemo and radiation, and Leo's helped us. All of the kids have been there for us, and it's good that I have them, because I don't know what I'd do without them. And Leo works for the school over in Heber. Chad is a security guard up at the Mayflower where they're doing all the construction. I can't remember the place they're building. He's a security guard there. Alicia works at the bank. Clint goes out the basin, works for his brother-in-law doing sheet metal and furnaces and air conditioning, and comes home to his wife and kids on the weekend. So they're all busy, and Annie, she takes care of me and her dad constantly. And Daniel's working, he's a constructor, not a contractor. He does construction work, finishing work, building work, he does all that stuff. So they're very gifted, talented. All of them have multi-talents, and I love all of them. I have 7 granddaughters and 1 grandson. So anyway, my grandma Luke had 7 sons, 8 granddaughters and 1 grandson, and my dad. So anyway, now I get 7 granddaughters and 1 grandson. So anyway, but my grandkids all live in Heber, so I'm lucky because I get to see them once in a while anyway. Oh, and how Midway got its name, you want to know? Okay. Well, there was the upper settlement, which the Sheltons lived in, which is on 6th North. That was all upper settlement. Then they had Stringtown down there, and then they had over by the fish hatch, where the fish hatchery is, that was all lower Midway too. When the Black Hawk War happened, they all moved Midway so that they were all together. And that's how Midway got its name, became Fort Midway.
Did they have permanent structures during that time, or were they just cabins and then they went back to?
They just had cabins. The one that my great grandma Shelton lived in was a cabin, but later on, I think they moved in and started rebuilding some of the homes that are here still. But yeah, they have the pictures of Fort Midway, and they kind of, it shows where they lived. And I had a lot of people that were there in that time. The Hares came later, but the other ones came earlier to this area. And I have 2 families that are the Swiss, but the others are Scotch and Irish, and a little bit of English. But anyway, the Midway Town Hall was used for so many things, and I had fun but I hated the basement. It was so, they used to, I don't think did they fill that all in with dirt behind the town hall? Because there was the thing that went down under? Okay, you had to drive the town trucks underneath there. That's where the maintenance shed was under the basement of the town hall. All the pipes and everything they needed to do repair on the pipes and the things that cut the pipes and stuff was all underneath in the basement. And then they had to drive the truck underneath there to work on it. And that's what they used for a long time was where they had all their equipment and stuff was underneath there. And the big furnace took up a great big space. I don't know if you've seen the furnace in the Midway Town Hall. It was a huge, and it was down in a hole. I mean, the cement come up, the sides are this high all around it. And it had stairs that you got down to it. And then they would have Halloween parties there. And the Halloween parties, the basement became the spook alley. I hated spook alleys, but they had spook alleys in there. And then they would have all kinds of fun games and things for the whole community. It wasn't just for kids, it was for everybody. And I brought a picture to show you, but it's, my mother was the fortune teller, the gypsy fortune teller. And so they had that, and she had her crystal ball and everything. And they would give prizes for the best costumes. And so my mom wore my dad's suit, and then she had this ugly mask that had a cigar hanging out of it. And nobody guessed who she was. So she won one of the prizes that year. So they had a lot of fun stuff that went on, you know. And then, of course, all the plays. Lethe Tadgey's husband, he did Jack and the Beanstalk when I was a kid. I don't know if a lot of people remember that or not, but they had a great big wooden thing that they built for the beanstalk, and then Francis was Jack, and he would climb up the beanstalk. Anyway, we had a lot of stuff like that. And Lethe Tadgey, growing up in Midway, if you didn't work for Lethe, you worked for Lethe. And guess what we got paid? Anywhere from 10 cents a day to a quarter. And we pulled weeds, and we whitewashed all her fences. And I remember I had flip-flops on, they call them now, and the lye that you paint the white fences dripped on my feet. When I got home, I had great big blisters where the lye had dripped down. But yeah, the kids that worked down at Lethe's, and that's what you did. You pulled weeds and you whitewashed. So anyway, it was fun growing up in Midway.
And when you go back to the cemeteries, I just find that fascinating, our two cemeteries in Midway. Because we didn't do that on tape, but that
Okay.
story is pretty amazing too.
Well, it's
There
just,
actually was too.
yeah, and I can't remember the years. It's this awful. It took 2.5 years for family history. I went and did all the cemetery, putting the names, the death dates, if they had a headstone, if they didn't have a headstone. And when I got the dates that they stopped using that one, but I can't remember right offhand when it was. But yeah, they decided to move it, and I don't know why they decided to move it. But it was up there where all the hot pots were and everything, and so maybe that's why they was looking for a different place for it. And they decided upon the one where it is now. And they moved, a lot of the people were moved from here up there, but a lot of them were left behind. And the histories that I found, I went through church ward records, everything, and found where these people were buried. And these people had to have been buried in that cemetery. But they do not have it recorded as that. They only have 4 graves up there, and that's not true. There was at least 27 graves left there. And Emily Coleman even told them that, and that was on the monument there. But it was kind of sad, but then they went over to this one and moved it to there.
But that was when it was being developed, was when they left.
Yeah, when they started to take over and develop that into Zermatt, and they put the tar over the graves and just said they weren't there. There was a lot of controversy went on at that time. A lot of people were very upset over it because at that time a lot of people couldn't afford the rocks, headstones. They had to just do the boards and put their names on it, and that's all there was. And I know I've got 2 family members that have to be buried there because they died at a certain age, and that cemetery was the only cemetery then. So, and now it's all mixed up again and having problems up there again. Because my dad, when he worked for Midway City, he dug all the graves by hand. They didn't have any equipment. He would go up, dig the graves, and then if they usually had a vault, and so Beasley's always brought the vaults up. But he would dig all the graves by hand with pick and shovel. And they would mark it off by foot. They didn't have computers. They had their feet. And so many, they would go like that, and that's how the original cemetery was marked off in feet. And then later on they had yardsticks and stuff of this nature, but originally it was marked off in that way. And they used to have Potter's Field on the side of it. And Potter's Field was for those who could not afford a burial. And somehow that has disappeared. It's on the outside fence as you go up past the cemetery. The fence is there. And the first road going around, that was Potter's Field. And there was people buried all along there. And then you made the turn, and there's still a couple of graves you can see as you make the turn on the top road. And one of them's the little French lady. And I found out all about her by looking in to the old records and found out what her name was. And Lethe Tadji always put flowers on her grave. Every year for Memorial Day, she would put flowers on the little French lady. And she's listed on the records now because I found who she was. So it's interesting, but, and I can never, it's just, you know, it was a different time. And growing up with my dad as the town marshal, he had all these jobs to do. So it was a family job. And my mom would go up and mow the lawns at the cemetery while Dad had to go do roads and stuff in the summer. And my sister and me had old sheep shears that you cut the wool off. That's what we clipped around every headstone in the Midway Cemetery. And we got blisters. But that's what you did. And when Dad had a burial, and when they had funerals in that day, they were anywhere from 1 to 2 o'clock in the afternoon. They weren't early, they were 1 or 2. Well, in the fall it got dark fast, so we would go up as soon as the burials were through, and Mama and Joan and me would throw dirt on the grave with Dad, and then we'd put all the flowers on top of the grave so we could help him get out of there. And we did that a lot. That was just what you did. And one day my mom, she went up to mow the lawn. You can believe this or not, she was out mowing the lawn and the lawnmower chased her. She said it just kept going and it finally hit a headstone and she jumped in her car and her car wouldn't start. And so she said, Dad never came looking for her. She was so upset. She said, he didn't come looking for me. And then my Aunt Jeanette was here from Arizona visiting, and she said to my grandma, Stella hasn't come home. I think we better ride up the cemetery and see what's going on. So they rode up, and there she was with the windows up and the car locked in the heat of the summer. So they got her home, and she was so upset at Dad. And she said, well, I thought you just wanted to finish, so I ate my lunch and left. So he had to go get the car and bring it home. But anyway, and they had a little brick shed then. And you didn't throw stuff away. You didn't. And so they would say, people would come up one day, you know, for Memorial Day, and it was always the same day. Now it's 3 and 4 and 5 different days. And Dad had to stay at the cemetery most of the day with the receipt book. And then he would sit there, and then cemetery lot, the care for a cemetery lot at that time was $5 a year. And so he had to be available at the cemetery so people that were coming to put the flowers on the grave could pay their cemetery lot for that year. And they would say to him, Leo, would you please put our containers in the shed and save it for us till we can get up here to get them? So he would. So the little shed always held people's baskets, And then when they had a chance to get to Midway, they would come and ask him if they could get their baskets. Don't happen now, they go in the garbage. But that's just what they did. So it was interesting. And like I said, I got to go into town hall and do a lot of things. And at Christmas time, they played records. They had a big micro thing on the top of the town hall. And we'd go over with Dad while he was doing other stuff. I got to go in and play the records, the Christmas records. And you'd start, I can't remember if we started at 7 o'clock, I think, and had to stop by 9. And so I got to go put all the records on the turntable and play the Christmas records. And the only time we ever missed was when Howard and Chloe and our son Marvin, I think he was either 16 or 17, he was more my sister's age than mine. He was at school and he was running the thing around the gym, and he laid down on the bench and he passed away, and it was just before Christmas. When Dad got retired from being the whatever he was a counselor. He served as a councilman for a couple of years. But him and I think it was Farron, did the maps of the Midway Cemetery. It's all wrote on there. And they went in and redone everything. And I think they spent a lot of time putting that cemetery maps together.
And that's on the disc, or is it someday?
I wrote I went through my dad's journals and took all the burials and the dates. And yeah, he did. In fact, I took them all over and digitized them at the Family History Center. I just have to go put them on a flash drive, but I took all his journals from 1952 till 1982 when he retired. And it tells everything he did during the day. And it's got, like I said, all the burials that he had. In fact, I found 3 more books the other day, little notebooks when he was in his councilman. He also came back and worked for the city. It was legal, they found it all out. And he mowed the lawns around here and watered the grounds, took care of, and sometimes even was up the cemetery. After he retired. And these books are 1988. And I thought, no, I found more books. And there are burials on there. One of them's Nephi Probst.
Oh, really?
And so I've got all those 3 little notebooks that I have found that stands there. He even had one in there, what he was doing after he went, or he took the day off, or whatever. And one of them says, Dr. Green and him, and I can't remember who the other 2 guys were, went snowmobiling today. And Dr. Green.
That's pretty special if you get a guy to do all that journaling, right?
Well, and he said, Dr. Green, he's a doctor, he knows better. They go up snowmobiling, and he says he wrapped one of the rubber hoses that they use in the doctor's office around the thing so it'd go faster. And then his snowmobile tipped over. He didn't put that in the book, but I know that's what happened the day they went. But anyway,
what did you bring to share with us?
Okay, and I had a lot more stuff I was going to tell you too, but
oh, you can still do that. We can still get an audio part of it with the pictures.
Okay, this is where you used to get Midway water. It was pure spring water. This is called the head house. They went up and checked it all the time. It's up Snake Creek. And they got their water from, it says on here, Gerber Springs. Anyway, so that's my dad. And of course, Gene Probst was the mayor then.
Can we look at those later after can we finish this part first?
Oh, okay.
Then I will copy those. You can talk about them.
Oh, okay.
But just set them aside.
Okay.
Then when we're done with this recording part, I'll put them on the lectern and I'll shoot close-ups of them, so.
Oh, okay.
they can be a part
And
of
so
the
I can just
video
say
as well.
that Midway used to get their water from Gerber Springs, and no chlorination at that time. Now it's in a whatever. But the Midway Town Hall, you might be interested in, is it was used for a lot of things. And this is part of the history I wrote about my dad. But it was used as the, when civil defense, when they decided that everybody needed to be prepared for an attack. Okay, Midway Town Hall was used for the Civil Defense Center. It was upstairs. They had barrels that were about 3 foot tall, and they had all kinds of stuff you needed in there. They had meals, they had emergency kits, they had toilet paper, anything that you would have needed at that time was in those barrels. So that was all up in there. And then they had, of course, different people representing each section of the town. And Dad was more or less over the whole thing. That was part of the job. And anyway, it was really interesting. And then the Army came to town every year. And they would have split in groups. They'd have the red team and the blue team. And some of them were up on the flat in Snake Creek. That's where their whole thing was. And then they would choose people in the town to help them. So if they would hide them in the back of the trucks, and then they would transport them to other areas in Midway. And my dad was one of them. And they were a spy, and so they were told to go home and tell their families if they come up missing and didn't get home that night, they'd know they'd be caught. So my dad would take the soldiers would lay down in the Midway work truck, and then they would cover it up with canvases and stuff, and then they would take them in different areas and drop them off. And so they did their maneuvers here. I don't know if they still do, but they used to do maneuvers here every year. And it was kind of fun because I was a teenager. And worked at the dairy or the Tim Freeze. So we had a lot of the young soldiers come in to eat. In fact, I had 2 friends that married 2 of the soldiers. But it was fun, and it was, this was really something that everybody looked forward to have the maneuvers come here. Like I said, I don't think they do it anymore, but they did at that time, and they did it because this had more mountain ranges, and so they had more areas to train the men in with the mountainous region. So it was interesting, and then we had, I talked about the wrestling that they had. They also had the DJs come up from Provo, and they had sock hops in the 50s, and I think they had one not too long ago too, but I don't remember when. But that was fun, and my sister was old enough to go to the sock hops. I wasn't in the early 50s. But anyway, when they got through, the DJs would have the demos that they'd play on the radio to see if people liked the songs. So they would get left there. And so Dad would bring home all these boxes of records that had been left at the town hall. The DJ would say, take them home to your kids. And so he did. So I've got a lot of 45s that were handed out as demos at that dance. So anyway, it was kind of fun. And then they had the National Guard. The National Guard had their offices in the Midway Town Hall. It was in the front part, as you walked in the front doors at the side. And Dave Wilson was I think he was the captain. And so that was in there for a long time too. And then I don't know if they did away with this up here or what, but when the National Guard moved out, then that's when they remodeled that men's bathroom on this side and made it bigger. That took up all where the National Guard's office had been. So that's a little bit of history too, and it was interesting. And then about when we went to school, every year you started school, the bell would ring. Every year, the last day of school, the bell would ring. So, and that bell is now sitting down in front of the grade school down there, after they decided to tear this building down. And when we were kids at school, the funnest thing was we'd walk around the building because they had sandstone that stuck out, a ledge about this wide, and you'd grab the windows and you'd walk all around the school. So we played marbles, jacks, and jumped the rope. So that was and the cafeteria was upstairs, and they had a big opening room there, a big space. They did in the bottom, you know that. And they had I forgot to tell you, we had a school nurse. Oh, what was her name? Sadie something. She was a lady, she never got married. What was her name? I think it was Thurman. Sadie Thurman was our school nurse. And she was up in one side, and they had a bed in there and a sick room. So if any of the kids got sick, they could go into that room and stay until they could get their parents. And so, yeah, That's, and you went up the first flight of stairs, which was the big one, from the bottom, and there was a restroom on that side of the stairs and another one on the other side of the stairs, and then you went up the main steps, and right at the head was the principal's office and the library, the school library. And then you'd go up the stairs to the other rooms, the 5th and 6th grade up there, where the cafeteria was and stuff. So it was interesting.
That was sad.
Oh, it was. It only had to have a new roof. I don't know why they did it. And my dad tells about the boys going under the school and that there was a lake under there. And the fish were blind because there was no light getting into it. And when Dad was working for the city, he had to go in and put railing, or what do you call them? Anyway, the gates, like metal things. He put one down on the corner so the kids couldn't crawl up and get up in there. And then he had to put one underneath the school where they were getting in to go down in there to keep them out of there so that one of the kids wouldn't get trapped underneath there in that water. So I don't know if many people know that or not, but there was. And so a lot of kids went down in there.
That was from the irrigation ditch?
Yeah.
The
Well, in there was water under. I don't know if the water was natural, because there's a lot of places here in Midway that there's water underneath it. So that was what you did. So
I have a question now that you bring up the water. So with original hot pots, the Luke pots, there is an underground lake there, right?
it's the pots. There's the great big pots were there full of the water, and there is hot water that runs down into it. Yeah.
Is there a lake under it? Or was there?
I'm not sure about that.
They
They,
used to say they used to take canoes down there.
I don't know. I never heard that, but they say there's one by the Memorial Hill too. That there was an underground lake there too. And so I don't know, but I know there was over here in this end of town. Because I think it goes over even to Dave Probst, where Dave Probst used to live on the corner across the road. And so yeah, like I said, a lot of kids did that. So anyway, I don't know what else. If there's anything else you want to know.
I think it's wonderful. I might get back with you with some names and different things like that, just make sure I understand it. And whatever you show us would be great.
All right.
And I saw some Luke Hot Pot book back there. We can maybe check that out later. We don't have to do it.
I have a collection of the postcards of Luke's Hot Pots. I have pictures of the family because my grandfather was their son. I just got a lot of stuff, And my grandma and Grandpa Luke, the White House they lived in, was one of the first houses in Midway to have indoor plumbing. When John Van Wagner bought it, he put indoor plumbing in it. That's where my dad was born. That was up on the corner. That's my. And my.
Become the mountain spa.
When Drapers bought it and Payne's.
I'm going to get with you about that story because somebody else told me about do you remember Uni down in
Yeah.
Boston? She was saying, oh, you have to hear that story about.
Oh yeah. There was a lot of scandal about his death.
Yeah.
A lot.
I don't know. Yeah, it could be interesting to get your take or have the articles where I tried to look it up once. I couldn't find anything.
Well, my grandma wrote her history, and I always thought that was part of Luke's Hot Pots, that little house, because when I was reading Grandma's history, she wrote that her and my grandfather got married, and the first year they went down to Fillmore and stayed because my great-grandpa also had a freighting business, Andrew Luke, and his sons all were in the freighting business and blacksmiths. And so they would go down there, and she said the first year they were married, they went down there, and then they had my uncle, was born here in Midway. Then they decided that they wanted their own home because they had rented the house out they were living in, which is on our street too. And so on First North. And she said that, what was I going to tell you? Anyway, that they bought the home from Jacob Snyder and moved it over there. So that's in my grandma's history. That little house came from Jacob Snyder. And then they bought the ground from a Mr. What was it? Started with a B. So I don't remember, but I have it all in histories. And they bought the ground from him and then bought the house from Jacob Snyder and moved it there. And that's where my dad was born there, and my Uncle Delbert wasn't. He was born in a different house. So my dad was born there, my twin uncles were born there, and I think my Uncle Dean was born, and my Uncle Gail. And then their last son was born in the White House by me. Or not, it's not white anymore, it's gray. And that's where their last son was born. So I've got her history. She tells about working for Luke's Hot Pots. I mean, if you're interested in stuff like that, I do have her history.
I mean, you and your family should preserve it, but you've got it preserved, basically.
Yeah.
Or if you need help, let us know, because that's what we can probably be really helpful for all that.
Well, it's interesting, and you know, the thing of it was, I have a story about my Aunt Emma Hassler. I loved that lady. She was the sweetest person I ever in the world. But she was 18 years old when she came up Provo Canyon, and she says she cried all the way because it reminded her of her home in Switzerland. But my grandma's uncle, Fred Hassler, went back to Switzerland as a missionary, and he met her. Her name was Emma Baumgardner. And he met her and converted her to the church. And then she came to America to marry him. And she was such a sweet lady. And she tells all about her trip up in the Heber Creeper. So I am blessed because I have a lot of histories, and I'm so thankful that my mother and her sister wrote the histories of their mom and dad, so that I have those. And Mom wrote Growing Up in Midway, and I brought that with me to show you that. So anyway, so if you need anything else later, just let me know. I wrote down stuff, but I don't
Amazing.
Oh, the things that they started here that they don't have anymore. They worked so hard to get a ball diamond here for Little League, and they finally got it. And I have a picture at home, but I don't know where it is right now, of the first Little League team. Glade Wilson was the coach. So all the kids that I went to school with are in that picture. And they worked hard to get that, and then look what it's gone now. They had rodeos at Harvest Days, and we used to park the cars around a circle around a square, and that was your arena. And then they wouldn't ride bulls, but they rode steers. And they would come out and, yeah. Anyhow, they had rodeos on the square. I just will say my dad was involved once. And one year we were there with all the cars in a row, and the steer jumped up on the hood of the car. So anyway, that's what you did. They'd have the greased pole where they'd have to climb the pole, and then they'd get the pig or whatever, and just stuff like that. And it was all free. It was Harvest Days. It was free. They'd have a program. They'd have a dance. They had a dance after the last night of Swiss Days. They would always have a dance. And yeah. So it was, and then when they started, they'd get a little bigger and a little bigger, and then they started, when Swiss Days started, they started having the Midway First Ward have a booth and the Midway Second Ward have a booth. And it was the Relief Society, and they would make pillowcases and dish towels and goodies and aprons and quilts, and had them to sell. It was for the church building funds. And so they did that, and then it was just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and all of a sudden it wasn't a town thing anymore. It's got to what it is today. And the big barbecue at the end of the day was free. it was to honor the harvest day and to come to the close of the season. So, and I got the privilege of being on a float, one of them. But I said, you know something, I don't think anybody took pictures. And at Nina Kohler, she's gone now. She was the president of the Daughters of the Pioneers. And she had a little tiny spinning wheel, and then she had a big spinning wheel, and then she had a little pioneer dress. I was the only one little enough to wear the pioneer dress, so I got to ride on the float by the little spinning wheel, and she was by the big spinning wheel. That was my fame. So anyway, but it was a good time then. And we rode our bikes all over the place. Nobody was afraid of anything, you know. It's just everybody knew everybody. It says it takes a town to raise a boy, and I think that everybody looked out for everybody at that time. And if you weren't related, you were still grandpa or grandma, and you were aunt or uncle. That's just how it was.